Hello everyone and welcome to the second episode of Data Science from Scratch. Today we're going to be talking about variables and functions and how we can use those in our code. Let's go ahead and start up the Anaconda Navigator and select the Launch button on the Jupyter Notebook. I've already done this and it should open up a new page in your web browser. Go ahead and find a location where you're happy to write some code. I've got it in my Documents folder here. Once you've done that, press the New button in the top right corner and select Python 3. Awesome. Now what we can do is click on the top left corner here where it says Untitled and write in a name for our notebook. I'm going to call this one Variables and Functions. Okay, now a unique thing about Jupyter Notebook is instead of writing code in one single page, you actually have multiple cells that you can execute in any order you prefer. It's a really great way to work in data science because you can lay out your notebook in any way that you want to, and it's really easy to read. So one thing that we can do is select code like what we've got here, but we can also choose Markdown as well. Now Markdown is a way of writing text, and you can actually use the hash symbol, which is pressing Shift and 3 on your keyboard, to write in different headers. So for this particular one, I'm just going to write in a heading here, variables and functions. And just note that the more hashes I add here, the smaller the text will get. There's a lot more that you can do with Markdown, but we may or may not touch on that later on in the course. It's not super important to know, but it does make sure that our notebook looks really neat and that it's readable by other people as well. Now in our notebook, we do have a few buttons on the top part of the page here. We've got a Save button, but you can also press Ctrl S on your keyboard to save. We've got a New Cell button, which will add a new cell into our notebook. We can also cut that cell as well, so deleting that. And we have a few other functions here which we might use later on as well, but that's all you need to know for now. So let's go ahead and start talking about variables. So variables are essentially a place to store information in your code. They're very dynamic, meaning that you can change the information that's inside of that variable as well as you go throughout your code. It's really important to use them because it means that you don't hard code information in your project. What I mean by hard code is instead of putting in the value 10, I can instead say my number, which is a variable, is equal to 10. And what that means is if this number 10, say that it represents a stock price for instance, that might change over time. So by putting it in a variable, it means that I can actually change this later down the track as the stock price changes as well. So it means that your code is a lot more dynamic. Let's go ahead and execute this cell by pressing Shift and Enter. And we've got our variable here, my number. Notice that unlike other programming languages, I don't need to define that it's an integer or a string or anything like that. And we can also use the print function here with 2 brackets just to print out that variable. And that shows that we've got the number 10 assigned to that variable there. Now, variables in Python are a lot more flexible than they are in other languages. What I mean by that is if I have my number here and I want to change the value of that, not only can I change it to another number, but I could even change it to a string as well. Now I know that this is a string because I have quotation marks surrounding it. These can either be single or double quoted. Once I've done that, I can just go ahead and print out my number again and notice that it's now a string instead. So they are very flexible. It is important though to keep track of this because sometimes you may not actually want it to be a string, you may only want it to be a number, so it's really important that you stay on top of that throughout your code and that you're aware of what you're assigning this variable to. Awesome. So let's move along here. The other great thing that we can do with variables is we can do any sort of multiplication or division with them as well. Say that I've got a variable a set to 10 and a variable b set to 5. I can do, as you would expect, a plus b, or multiplication, division. There's even one called modulo as well, which is essentially getting the remainder of that number. So if I had a is equal to 12 here, then the leftover of 12 divided by 5 is 2. Okay, so the next thing I wanted to talk about was functions. Now, let's come up with a scenario here just as an example. Imagine that I'm an investor and I'm interested in the growth of my portfolio. Now, depending on who I am, I might want to check this every day or every month or every hour even, depending on what kind of trading I'm doing. Now, functions are great for this kind of repetitive nature because functions allow you to reuse your code over and over again. Instead of having to write out the same lines of code, and this can be as many lines of code as you want, some functions can even be over 100 lines of code long. And instead of having to rewrite or copy and paste that code over again, you can actually just put it inside of a function and call that function as many times as you need it to. And that helps to keep your code very compact. It keeps it really neat, and it also makes it really easy to change parts of that code as well. Because imagine that you'd written out the same code 100 times and then need to make one little change to it. You'd have to make that change 100 times. But with a function, you can actually just make that change once, and that will allow you to change all of those 100 times that you've used the function. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm just going to write down a little note here, which is going to be our growth calculation, just so that I remember it. So growth is equal to the present minus the past value divided by the past. And in this case, I'm talking about a stock, just as an example. Okay, so one way that we could write this if we were just using our variables from before is to say that we have a present value, say that the stock price is currently worth $10, but when I purchased it, it was about $2. Now what we can do is say that growth is equal to present minus past divided by past. And let's go ahead and print out that growth value. Now just remember, or just note here that it's really important that I've added brackets here. This means that the calculation is done in the way that I expect it to. I want the present and past values to be minus first and then divided by the past value. So that's part of order of operations there, because without the brackets, I would be doing this calculation first and then doing the minusing. So it's really important to have the brackets there to let Python know that I want to calculate that part first. So we can see our growth value here is 400%, so that's awesome. Now let's go ahead and create a function with this code inside of it instead, because otherwise if we wanted to calculate this with different values, we would have to go ahead and copy and paste that over and over again like I mentioned earlier. So to tell Python that we want to create a function, we need to write out a keyword, which is def. It's short for define, and what we're defining is a new function. Next, we need to come up with a name for that function. So I'm going to say calculate growth as my function name. It is important that with variables and functions that you make sure that you write down names that are meaningful to you, or meaningful to anyone that's reading your code. Because without that, you may forget what a function does and it won't be as clear to you straight away. So it's a good practice to come up with meaningful names for your functions and variables. Next, we just need to add in some brackets and a colon straight afterwards, just like that. Now between the brackets, we can actually add inputs into our function. So what this means is any sort of values that we want to use inside of the function, we should put it as an input as well. And I'll show you how this works later on, but for now, let's go ahead and put in our present and past values. Once we hit enter, Python automatically indents our code. So you can see here that there's actually 4 spaces here. It's equivalent to just pressing tab on your keyboard, just like that. Now, Python uses white space as a way to tell where code should sit. And what I mean by that is if I was to write some code here, just saying print hello, for example, Python now knows that this line of code belongs to this function here. But if I got rid of that line, that tab, the white space, then Python thinks that I'm defining this function here, but that there's nothing inside it. Now this is different to other programming languages. It is common practice to add the tab in other programming languages as well, but it won't break the code in the same way. In Python, if I was to execute this cell with Shift and Enter, it would come up with an indentation error. And it says expected an indented block, which means that I have to press tab here. Okay, so now that I've done that, the calculate growth function right now is just printing hello, so that doesn't really make sense. Let's go ahead and put in our value straight away. So we might actually just copy this, and we'll press Shift and Enter to run the cell. Okay, now if we were to call this function, all we need to do is write in the name of the function there, and then we need to put in some values for present and past. So let's say, let's actually use the example from before because we know the answer. Let's say the present value is 10 and the past value is 2. Now if I was to execute this with Shift and Enter just like I've done, there isn't anything that happens. That's because while we've actually done the calculation inside of the function, we haven't actually done anything with our output. We've done our inputs, we've done our code, but we haven't output anything from the function. So all we need is the keyword return, and then we need to decide what we want to return. In this case, we're going to return growth. So let's go ahead and execute those two lines of code again, and there you go. We've got our answer to growth, which is 400%. Now, if we wanted to, for example, calculate growth on another stock that that the current value is $8, but we purchased it for 16, then we can see that it comes up with that different value as well. Now, imagine that we've calculated this hundreds of times and we want to make a change to our code. All we have to do is go back to our original function over here and say that we just want to add 1, for example. Then we can go ahead and execute these lines of code again and the changes will be made straight away. I don't have to go into each line of code again and change that value. Alright, that's all for now on variables and functions. If it seems a bit overwhelming, feel free to watch the video again, but we will be touching on these topics later on in the course as well, so I'm sure you'll pick it up then as well. It can seem a bit confusing with the functions, what does DEF mean and what order do I need to write things down, but you will get a lot more familiar with these, so don't worry too much if you haven't got it yet. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.